Hello everyone, welcome to the Dome9 webinar this morning. We are going to give people a few minutes to join. Please stand by for 2 minutes and we'll be back with you shortly. Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome to the Dome9 webinar, Create Easily Understood Policies in a Snap with Dome9 Governance Specification Language. My name is Ellen Blum. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Dome9, and I'm here with Patrick Pusher, our Director of Customer Advocacy for Dome9 Security. Common data and information security best practices lie at the heart of all standard-based regulations. The traditional method of manual asset review and policy checks are time-consuming, error-prone, and impractical at scale. Many times, the IT process around governance fails to meet the requirements as stipulated by the business. In this 60-minute webinar, we will provide a hands-on training showcasing Dome9's Compliance Engine's innovative language of specifying security policies called Governance Specification Language, or GSL. A rule that would take over 100 lines of code now requires less than 100 characters when specified with GSL. Unlike other systems that require writing code to define custom rules, GSL allows administrators to create new rules that are written in common language and easy to understand, thus helping to eliminate errors in translation and simplify governance. With this webinar, we will close with Q&A at the end of the session. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the questions window of GoToWebinar, and Patrick will address as many questions as possible, time permitting. We also have a handout, a copy of the Dome9 Compliance Engine, which features our Dome9's compliance and governance, and GSL, what we're covering in the webinar, is located on the back. Feel free to download this content at any time during the webinar. Without further ado, I will now pass the ball to Patrick. Let's get started.
Thank you, Thalen, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As Thalen suggests, we'll spend the next about 50 minutes speaking about compliance and governance, and maybe more specifically, Dome9's unique take on really asserting the kinds of conditions that you want to test for in your infrastructure efforts, really across the 3 different platforms that Dome9 supports. That's AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Compute Platform. So to level set, what we'll start with is just an overview of why compliance and governance in an ever-changing, highly dynamic infrastructure as a service environment is so challenging. Then we'll talk a little bit about Dome9's unique take on compliance and governance with a demonstration of the platform. We'll then get into really the heart of the topic today, Dome9's Governance Specification Language, or GSL, and we'll look at some hands-on practical examples. And then we'll wrap up and we'll talk very briefly how the rest of the Dome9 platform, once you get your infrastructure state exactly where you want it, how the rest of the Dome9 platform really helps you keep that configuration enforced on a continual basis. So compliance can mean, I think, different things to different people. So level setting on exactly what we mean when we refer to compliance, I think, is a helpful and useful exercise. And really, we see three different sorts of compliance use cases, if you will. First, kind of the general regulation, right, that isn't industry specific, but maybe it's operational specific. A good example of this is the PCI DSS, right, where it certainly spans industries, but of course it's related to credit card processing and the storage and access to PII. In the middle there, we have more a sectoral perspective, right, where we think about specific regulations that pertain to financial services, or something like HIPAA high-tech that pertains to healthcare, where these are, not so much across operations, but more having to do with an industry vertical. And then on the far right-hand side, of course, less of a regulated state, but one where organizationally it may be desired to really prove how important we take security to internal stakeholders, to customers, less of a formal regulated perspective and more of just an overall desire to ensure that our stakeholders within or external to an organization really do understand how important security is to us. And that's probably our best segue into talking about governance versus compliance. And governance is certainly similar to compliance, but is often larger and more comprehensive, right, encompassing concepts like policy and like risk. And it's really about putting in place a multidisciplinary framework whereby an organization can scale their IT efforts with the confidence that policy is never compromised. And governance includes, policy libraries, education, IT asset repositories, exception management and process, and really much more. It's a very sort of broad discipline. Many times there is a loss that happens in translation from business requirement to the tooling used to monitor infrastructure, right? If you're familiar with the telephone game that many of us played as children, you already understand this. When a message gets passed on from party to party, as is the case of with this game of telephone, and is the case too when policymakers must work with developers or infrastructure professionals to put policy into action, that message winds up being non-trivially different than it was when it originated. Understanding your asset inventory in infrastructure as a service environments means understanding context as well. And with the usage of features such as auto-scaling, asset inventories can change very drastically over time. And this fact really obsoletes the spreadsheet-based governance approach we have utilized in the past with traditional environments. Finding problems is rather obviously, right, the first line of business. But once issues are identified, what do you do with those, right? Is IT and therefore problem resolution centralized, or do business units operate independently and differently? As stakeholders grow, so too do perspectives and expectations. How about an approach where a proactive, not to mention a previously agreed upon solution to a problem, is identified and carried out automatically when certain conditions are met, for example? And then how about the ability to ensure that the security controls in question can never change in the same way again? Maybe we're running a little bit before we walk here. Let's quickly take a little bit more time and focus around why this is such a challenge. Infrastructure as a service environments are purpose-built to be agile enough to serve the needs of modern IT. I think once this agility becomes understood throughout an organization, different use cases, different applications, different projects, maybe even different business units utilize the cloud in different ways. And these varying perspectives and a variance in skill maturity more often than not translate to a lack of standardization on how security controls are utilized. Right? Add to this that modern cloud native applications can scale their own infrastructure in response to application demand, for example. And you have a very, very dynamic, ever-changing infrastructure footprint. Being able to measure in a continuous fashion where your infrastructure and security control states deviate from a desired baseline configuration becomes really, really essential in your overall sort of compliance or governance path. So Dome9's unique take on managing this delta between kind of where you are and where you want to be really involves assessing your compliance posture using automated data aggregation. So we're going to talk very quickly around the wide perspective that the Dome9 platform has across network exposure kinds of scenarios, identity and access management policy, S3 in the case of AWS, S3 bucket policy configuration, really a wide range of services and their corresponding configuration options. We're going to show you how you can identify risks and again, gaps in that where you are today versus where you want to be using built-in test suites. So Dome9 ships with pre-published compliance test suites, as well as the ability, and this is really the focus of the webinar today, to assert your own rules using a domain-specific language we have called GSL, or Governance Specification Language. And we're going to dive deep into GSL and exactly how that works. We're also going to talk very briefly around how you fix issues that are found by the Dome9 Compliance and Governance Engine toolset. And this can be done in a manual way, but can also be done in an automatic sort of remediation fashion, and we'll touch on that briefly today. And then we'll show you the output of the Compliance and Governance Engine, what kind of format the information is conveyed in, and different ways you can use it. Certainly, kind of the interactive path where you do an assessment and you get a report is one way, but there are certainly other ways to do this, including leveraging the Dome9 API in a more pragmatic fashion to really bring it into your existing processes, whatever those may be. So why consider the Dome9 Compliance Engine maybe over different and competing approaches to this problem? I think as we talked about very briefly, Dome9 has a very, very wide perspective. Dome9 integrates with the platforms we support via API. So no agents, no appliances, which means we have both a wide perspective over many services within each respective supported platform, but also that we do a lot more than intro workload sort of compliance assessment, right, across network security, again, across hosted storage, across identity and access management as well. We talked a little bit briefly about this, but the ability to also remediate problems in the Dome9 platform without leaving the tool. So there are many different ways to correct problems within Dome9 without having to necessarily have the console of the respective cloud platform that you're working in open as well. Dome9 is more than information or monitoring. It's also an active control plane to fix the problems that you identify using the Compliance and Governance Engine. And then specific features exist to be able to lock down your configurations such that going forward you won't experience the drift that really brought you out of compliance in the first place. And we'll touch on those features at the end of our webinar very briefly as well. And then we'll talk a little bit again about the report format, how we can trend our efforts over time from a compliance perspective, how we can see how we're doing, and really who this report is purpose-built for. And we'll touch upon that very, very quickly. So at the core of all of this is what we call the Governance Specification Language, or GSL. And GSL is really a means to express what's important to you, right? In combination with the Dome9 Compliance Engine, this is a non-developer focused approach that really, the main goal is, again, to assess how far you are away from your desired baseline configuration, whatever that may be. And certainly we have what we call rule bundles pre-published in the platform for standards like PCI, for standards like HIPAA high-tech in the case of healthcare, and for less formal standards such as the CIS benchmarks, for example, that you can sort of use off the shelf and begin being very effective immediately after connecting your cloud accounts to Dome9. But we also have, again, this ability via GSL to really write very, very specific rules that are important for your organization internally, with specificity that you may not find in any pre-published standard. And we'll touch upon that very, very quickly. So let's dive in a little bit to what GSL looks like. And without even getting into the syntax, we're going to splash up a handful of rules, and I think you'll agree with me that they're quite straightforward to understand. So first, we have a rule that says security group should not have inbound rules with port 22 and a scope of 0.0.0.0. What this rule means is that any security group shouldn't have any rules in the inbound direction, because of course security groups can define traffic flow inbound and outbound, on port 22, which is most commonly associated with Secure Shell, a very sensitive network service, with a wide open scope. So you don't need, again, we'll look at this, I think, in the next slide, but you don't need a developer skill set to really be able to understand what this rule means. And that is the whole intent behind GSL, is to be able to assert this very, very briefly and in a concise and easily to understand manner. Let's look at another one. Instance, so our virtual machine in the case of AWS, should have a name and tags with key equals owner. So this is really more about a tagging standard, and this goes back to the statement I made on the last slide, where having support for pre-published standards is very powerful, but so too is the ability to augment those with conditions that are very, very specific for your organization, right? No pre-published data security standard will understand your naming or your tag convention, and that's something you can sort of have the best of both worlds with Dome9. You can use a pre-published standard, you can augment it with what's really, really specific within your organization, like a naming or a tag standard, and really reduce the number of false positives you get when exercising what we call that rule bundle. Let's look at one more example. Security group where name equals default should not have inbound rules. And this is a best practice really across any firewall as a service, let's call it, across any of the platforms that we support, whereby default security groups that can't be necessarily disabled from a infrastructure as a service provider perspective, really are the best practice is to not use them at all. So this is a rule that says, hey, whenever I have a security group where the name is default, it shouldn't have any inbound rules. We could also augment this rule and say it should also not have any associations with any resources, right? And even make it more strong. But the idea is that, being able to understand what the intent of this rule, just by looking at it, even without a corresponding description, is relatively straightforward. And again, that's the whole goal of Dome9 GSL. So in competing solutions, even with the platforms we support themselves, never mind third-party add-on products, authoring rules, custom rules, can be a very lengthy process, and will necessarily involve a developer skill set, right, with writing code, such as you see on the screen here. So this is a rule that says, do not open common internet file sharing, which is obviously a permissive protocol used to share files to the entire internet. This is what it looks like with a competitive approach to Dome9. This is what it looks like with Dome9 GSL. And that's very, very powerful. Again, for not only for understanding, the ease of understanding, but in terms of authoring a rule like this, no longer, again, do you need to be able to actually write code. You can do this in a brief but expressive language, such as GSL with Dome9 very simply. So we often internally kind of consider this from hundreds of lines of code to the size of a tweet, and that's what GSL really provides. So we're going to talk a little bit in theory around automated remediation as well as we sort of launch into the demo. We do have dedicated webinar sessions on auto remediation, so we'll talk about it in theory. We won't launch into the automated remediation side within this webinar, but certainly I'll introduce you to those concepts and make sure I leave you with the knowledge required to understand how this is done. With that said, let's get into the hands-on portion. Okay, so welcome to your Dome9 dashboard. This is what the dashboard looks like. We're going to get into the compliance engine, so we'll do that via the compliance and governance menu. And let's take a look at some of the concepts I've introduced you to in theory, now in practice. So the compliance engine, again, is really all about measuring where you are from an infrastructure and security control state compared to where you want to be. And if you look at this horizontal line here, everything above it, and you can see my cursor moving back and forth, everything above it in terms of PCI DSS, HIPAA high-tech, CIS benchmarks, these are what we call rule bundles that ship with the Dome9 product. So for an idea of how you get started, you come and you connect your AWS, your Azure, or your GCP account with Dome9 via, not with credential exchange. I mean, that's certainly the old way of doing things. You do this by building roles and policies or the corresponding and equivalent ways of doing that within the other platforms that grant Dome9 the ability to understand the infrastructure and security control state within your respective cloud accounts. Very shortly after that period, we're talking minutes, definitely not hours, you're able to then come to Dome9 and run any of these what we call rule bundles against those cloud accounts. And these rule bundles, if I highlight PCI, for example, will give you a feel for the kinds of things we measure. Dome9 grew up on the network security side of the house. We spent, we're about 6 years old, and we spent, the first half of our life really squarely on the network security side. So, extending concepts like security groups, giving you visibility into changes around the configuration of such, tools like Dome9 Clarity, which give you a Visio diagram kind of map of all the potential traffic flows within your network. And we still certainly have a lot of those kinds of measurements within the compliance and governance tool set. But we've also really expanded into really many different services offered by our integration partners. So things like identity and access, where I can measure, do I have an effective password policy? Am I assigning overly permissive capabilities to IAM users or IAM roles? Am I avoiding the use of the root account, as you can see as that first rule suggests up top? We measure things like S3 storage bucket exposure. We measure things like key rotation within KMS, the key management service within AWS. Hosted databases, all sorts of different services and different conditions in those services that really give you, again, that wide perspective around the kinds of things you want to test in your overall security posture. And so what we'll do first is we'll take one of these rule bundles, but before I do that, I'm going to flip the switch up top that says Show GSL. And you'll see that even our internal bundles are built on top of rules expressed in Governance Specification Language. And you can see these rules here. These are not descriptions, these are the actual rules themselves that make understanding exactly what we're testing very, very straightforward. We're going to get into the syntax of GSL shortly in a lot more depth, so don't worry about that too much right now. But that Show GSL is an important switch to better understand exactly what each rule is actually reaching out to each cloud platform and measuring. So let's have a quick look at what the output of the compliance and governance engine looks like first. So I'll take this PCI DSS. I mean, even though it is kind of a specific rule bundle, it's a really nice cross-section of 76 different measurements that we're going to exercise against, in this case, our AWS account. And I'll show you what the resulting report looks like, who it's intended for, and exactly how that works within Dome9. So I'm going to click this Run Assessment button. And you'll notice we have a couple different options here. I can run this against a live environment, and that's what I'm going to do today in the webinar. But I can also run this against a CloudFormation template. We've got support for CFT assessment within multiple areas of the Dome9 platform. Within the compliance and governance side, this is very useful for getting Dome9 involved in, in processes that might be important to you organizationally, right? You may have or follow a paradigm rather that says, we don't necessarily fix problems that we find in production. We fix them in our infrastructure as code state. So in this case, a CloudFormation template. We security peer review those, and then we provision those through AWS, as a tightly managed process, right? This is sort of commonly known as an immutable infrastructure paradigm, where instead of ad hoc fixing problems, we follow a process whereby we express this in code, we review that, and then we provision. And the ability to judge CloudFormation templates is really key to that process. So just know that Dome9 works equally well assessing live infrastructure as it does being able to measure infrastructure as code in the format of CloudFormation templates. Today, however, we're going to do this live against one of the accounts we have connected to this Dome9 demo environment. You can see we have two, and you can also see that we have an option to run this test against them all. So, the largest scale Dome9 enterprise customers have hundreds of cloud accounts. And imagine the power of being able to take one rule bundle, either something off the shelf like we're doing now, or something built custom by you, or any combination thereof, and being able to assert that across all of the accounts you manage with Dome9 at once. I mean, it's a very, very powerful capability. I'm sure you're familiar with the respective cloud consoles of each platform we support. That often you are jailed not only by region but by account. Here, of course, we break those boundaries and allow you to test across really all of those accounts at once. So very, very powerful. We'll do this across one account. You can also go in the other direction, whereby you may be segregating your cloud accounts in a different way, in a more detailed and specific way, whereby you want to test a single region or even a single VPC inside a single region, and that is also supported by Dome9. So let's choose a complete account. We'll click Run, and then I'll give you a feel for what this information looks like from an output perspective. So as you can see, what we've done here is we've exercised this PCI DSS rule bundle, and we have about a 72 to 27% fail pass ratio, which isn't very good, but we've got a lot of obviously a lot of sort of pre-canned problems or misconfigurations, if you will, in our demo environment to prove some points here. One is that this report is really built, split into two different perspectives. One for that management perspective, that aggregation of data perspective, compliance officer perspective perhaps, whereby we're interested in the overall pass-fail ratio. We're interested in the breakdown of where we failed, how we failed by severity. Perhaps we're interested in the kinds of resources we tested. In this case, we did a lot of security group tests, did a fair bit of instance or workload-related tests, mostly around network service exposure. We did some tests around privileges and IAM users, and so on. Also some S3 bucket storage tests. In an interactive way, we can also explore our region map and look at exactly how we did from a regional perspective. Right, so I can click on any region, and I can see, for example, in Northern California, I did a little bit better than my overall pass-fail ratio. Right, this is more like it's a better pass-fail ratio than I did kind of globally, and I can explore region for region. This one's even better, and so on and so on. this region actually is the best one I've looked at so far. Maybe that should be my blueprint for how I manage, you know, infrastructure sort of globally. Maybe there's some lessons learned in that London region. The second half of this report is really built for the practitioner, right? The individual or team that you will task for going and remediating or solving the problems that the compliance engine found. And we can look at all of these. We can filter them by the kinds of resources we tested. In the case of a pre-published data security standard, we can filter them by compliance section. We can filter them by severity or by the fact that whether we passed or we failed them. So we have at our fingertips now each test that we failed. If we click this expand link, we can see exactly how we failed them, right? The resources that failed this test. So what this rule is telling me here is that I tested all of my security groups, and I tested them for very broad access to Secure Shell, a sensitive network service, and broad meaning kind of wide open to the internet. And out of 223 security groups that were relevant and tested, I had 10 that didn't comply or that failed. And these 10 security groups are listed here. And as we talked about, Dome9 is not only information, it's also the ability to go ahead and fix some of the problems that were unearthed by this particular compliance run. So I can click on any of these security groups, visit them in another portion of Dome9, and actively fix them. We're not going to go too far down this path today. I mean, we're striving to the point where we talk a little bit more about GSL, or Governance Specification Language, but I want to ensure you know that Dome9 is much more than a read-only tool set. It also gives you the ability to fix some of the problems that you find with the compliance engine. Not only that, but to keep them fixed. And if we have time at the end, we're going to come back here and better understand how that works. So that's the that's what the compliance engine looks like from an execution perspective. What the report format looks like as it happens, and this is the information again that those tasked with solving these problems will leverage, either through the use of the continued use of Dome9, or they will take this information. You know, you can route it to a SOC or a NOC team that's responsible for monitoring on a continuous basis, and make sure they understand where you deviate again from that desired configuration, whether it's formal or more sort of best practice driven. So let's go back to the compliance engine dashboard, or main screen, I should say. And one thing that's really important to know, and we touched upon it briefly in the slide introduction, is that you also have the ability to chart your assessment history. Right? Every compliance run you take is documented from a historical perspective within Dome9, such that you can understand how you trend over time, both in this assessment history kind of way, but also in the compliance dashboard. So the compliance dashboard will chart across all the accounts you have connected to Dome9 how you've done run for run of each compliance assessment. And you can filter this, you know, for what's important to you. You know, you may run a multitude of different compliance standards, but maybe within this dashboard perspective, you're really only interested in a handful of them, right? You can select and filter these views, but this gives you that ability to again understand over time how you're doing from a compliance perspective. It's also very helpful for auditors that might have their own Dome9 account. We won't get into it in this webinar, but there is a full role-based access system whereby you can specify, you know, a user to only have audit privilege. So they can come in, they can look at historical assessment runs, but they have no ability to change anything with Dome9. That's certainly an option for creating users within the platform. And so they can come in, they can look at your assessment history, you know, how you've done from an execution perspective over time, and really get a feel for how you're trending towards your compliance goal. Okay, so let's now look at in a little more detail GSL and how we define custom rules. So for that, we talked a little bit about kind of the pre-published standards we have above this horizontal break here. Below it are all of the compliance bundles that we've either cloned, because as you may have noticed already, I can choose one of these pre-published bundles and I can clone them. And when I do that, they will appear down below. As you can see, somebody here has cloned our CIS AWS Foundations benchmark bundle, cloned it, and now it's an editable copy ready for you to come and customize using GSL. We're going to look at something slightly different. We're going to go ahead and leverage what we have called our playground, which means, I may want to experiment with writing my own rules, not quite yet as part of an overall bundle, not quite that formally, but I want to get some exposure to GSL, and I want to try and understand how I do this. For that, I may leverage what we have called the playground. And if you understand the syntax of GSL, you're free to write it kind of as it stands, as it exists. If you're less familiar with GSL, we have a more guided sort of on-the-rails process called the Rule Builder. And the Rule Builder kind of steps you through iteratively the construction of a rule written in GSL. And so we're going to just walk through a few different samples of things that we might be interested in testing against our infrastructure and security control state, and get a feel for what that process looks like. So the first thing we might want to test, and this is just an example that I've got prepared, is let's think about we'll do one traditional and kind of one less traditional kind of test. Let's think about a network exposure kind of scenario. Or at least one based on a security group. Let's test for, let's say organizationally it's important for us that our security groups that are assigned to resources, because of course I can have a security group that exists that isn't assigned to a resource, an instance, or an RDS instance, for example. But let's say a security group that is assigned to a resource must follow a specific tagging standard, right? That's something we want to mandate organizationally. So how we might do that is, the first thing is it's a security group we're interested in testing, so let's select that. And now you can see the Rule Builder will step us through all of the options that we have for asserting against security group. So security group, and we have a condition, right? We talked about security groups that are assigned to resources. So security group where network asset stats contain count greater than 0, because of course we said we want the network resources assigned to this. We want some network resources assigned to this security group as part of our rule. So greater than 0, meaning one or more. Should have tags. Remember, it's a tagging standard we're interested in evaluating. With key equals, again, whatever. You'll have your tagging standard specified, of course, and this is what I referred to earlier. No pre-published data security standard will understand what your internal tagging standard is. You may use tags to segregate, networks with confidential data from networks that aren't. You may use tags to segregate security groups that belong to a particular business unit from another. The possibilities are endless. But the takeaway is that having the ability to specify this in this amount of detail means you're going to get closer and closer to actually testing what's interesting and valuable to you. And there we go. We've written this rule that says any security group that does have resource assignments associated with it should have a tagging standard that includes, specifying the key. You also probably noticed as I was walking through this, I could also specify the key value, right? I left it at key, but I could get more and more comprehensive with this rule as I'd like. And then as we build it with the Rule Builder, now I have the ability to unit test it across any of the accounts I have connected to Dome9, and we'll leave it here with the default of AWS prod, and I can test it. And I happen to know that I have nothing tagged with the key of whatever in my demo environment, so I expect complete failure, and that's exactly what I have. Now, what this means is I have 223 security groups, but I only have 70 relevant. That means I only have 70 that have active resources assigned to them. So out of 70 relevant, 70 that match the conditions of my rule, 70 failed, meaning none of them have the key equal to whatever. Which makes sense, right? If I had a key that was actually valid, I would have some passes, and then the rest would fail if they didn't contain that key. So that's how straightforward that is. And again, that's the guided process that the Rule Builder really provides for you. Let's do another one. Let's go back into the rule builder, and instead of testing against security groups, let's do something against identity and access management. So we know it's the best practice that IAM policies really should only be attached to groups or roles and not directly to users, right? How do we test for that within the Dome9 Compliance Engine? Well, we'll start with a different kind of entity, of course, than security group. We're going to test IAM users, and we're going to say IAM user. Again, we'll have a condition where, and this time we're going to use a negative, not, because we want to avoid, potentially we want to avoid assessing our root account. Maybe we want some flexibility to say, on our root account, we do want to attach directly attached policies, even if that's a deny policy, to our user account and not use a role or a group. So let's account for that. Let's say IAM user, we're not name, like, and here we'll use some special characters to ensure we capture a variation of syntax. Should have manage policies being empty, and where is it? Inline policies as well being empty. So what this means is any IAM user, and I'm going to evaluate them all, I'm going to iterate through every single one in this AWS prod account that doesn't match a name like root account, should have empty managed policies and empty inline policies. Right? I could kind of reverse this and test a role, for example, and say that they should have populated managed policies and inline policies, where I want to test a role and not a user. But in this case, I want to say nope. I want to make sure I'm not assigning direct rights to a user account. I'd rather do that against roles and groups to conform with best practices. So let's test that. And so in this case, out of 20, so I have 28 users. I have 27 relevant because I have one root account, which I've kind of disqualified with this condition. I have 26 of those that didn't comply. So for 26 of my IAM users, I am applying direct user permissions. And if I want a complete list of those users, I've got that here. Just like I could get a complete list of my security groups, for example, when I was testing the security group entity rather than IAM user. So that's how, if you know the syntax of GSL, you could have done this straight in the text editor. But if you don't, or if you've forgotten, or if you want a little bit of help, that rule builder kind of what I think of as the rule construction kit will iterate with you through the construction of a rule, kind of specifying at each respective stage what your options are. And that's a very, very powerful approach. So let's navigate back to the compliance engine. So we've talked about a rule to do with a security group. We talked about a rule to do with IAM users. Let's look at rules to do with S3 storage. Certainly S3 storage is probably on the top of most of our minds around some of the exposure scenarios we've read about. There was a new one this week around customer data, I think, for a private company that was wide open exposed in an S3 bucket. So let's have a look at those. So we may be interested in understanding and measuring when an S3 bucket policy is sort of wide open for anonymous access. So here's a rule, and the entity starts with S3 bucket, and now we're measuring both ACL grants and S3 bucket policy, and making sure that, and we're using an OR statement to join both of these statements. So we're saying if either of these conditions are met, and we're using a negative, meaning, look, if we have an ACL grant that's too permissive, or if we have a bucket policy that pertains to everybody, that's what that principal equals asterisk, or principal that AWS equals asterisk, then this rule should fail. And this is the idea, is to be able to assert, again, across S3 buckets in general, and now we're asserting across two different access control methods, right? One in ACL and one in S3 bucket policy. There's actually a third vector by which we could specify policy to do with S3 buckets, and that's IAM policy. And so we could write a rule to do with IAM policy as well. There we would point it at the IAM user or IAM role entity to measure that, right, with some specificity in the conditional statements we write the rule with. So, you know, it really depends on what you're trying to measure. There are some other examples here that might be useful. Dome9 participated in the New York City AWS Summit last month, and we did a talk around S3 exposure specifically. Using the Dome9 rule engine, we built a couple different rules. One where we're not measuring bucket exposure, but we're measuring for certain conditions that we want to find within that bucket policy. Namely, you know, those conditions that mandate, in this case, the fact that S3 bucket access is mandated to be done securely, right, and not with an insecure clear text protocol. So in this case, we're measuring that S3 bucket policy to ensure that we've got HTTPS or TLS or SSL access mandated through that bucket policy. So anything you can assert in a bucket policy, you can measure for in the Dome9 Compliance and Governance Engine, and this is a great example of that. So hopefully that gives you a feel for the power of GSL, the expressiveness, yet how simple it is to understand at a glance. And there are many, many examples within Dome9, you know, pre-published, and that's where, you know, if I'm a new Dome9 user, this is definitely where I'd start. I come to a pre-published bundle, as you saw me do earlier, switch that show GSL option, and just step through each of these rules and get an understanding for how this works. You know, for example, you know, here's one that says, I should have a password policy defined and enforced, right? And so in this case, I'm not testing against IAM user, I'm testing against my IAM policy at large. So my entity is IAM instead of IAM user or IAM role. IAM should have password policy enabled equals true, right? And it's that simple, making sure that I have that turned on, and as I step through this, I'll get a list of all the accounts that either conform or violate this policy. And that's an example of a pre-published rule in a pre-published bundle that just by flipping on that GSL switch, you can sort of get to know. Accompanied with the GSL documentation within Dome9, it is certainly enough for you to understand exactly what's going on within that rule. Okay, so with that, let's pivot back quickly to our slide deck. And what I want to talk about next is just a very, very brief synopsis of once you identify those conditions that really violate either your externally mandated data security standard policy or what's important to you internally as an organization, and you fix those, then Dome9 has a completely different feature set to help you keep those fixed over time. And in the area of security groups, Dome9 has functionality both called region lock and tamper protection, which will allow you to rest easy knowing that nothing can bring you out of that compliance state in the future, right? So let's say you had an overly permissive IAM structure. Perhaps you had a developer that had enough rights to go to the AWS console and institute a new rule in a security group just out of convenience that opened up SSH to the world, right? We'll use the same example we used earlier in our compliance and governance example. Once you fix that, maybe you yank that rule out of the security group, you can flip on this switch that you see on the screen now called protection mode into full protection. And Dome9 is your 24/7 watchdog, continually watching the configuration of each security group within all the accounts you have connected to Dome9. And if that change is attempted again, Dome9 will see it and will actively revert it, will actively back it out of your security group configuration. Right, and this is the notion we have, or the capability we have called tamper protection, meaning, okay, you know, I've found these deviances with the compliance engine. I've come to Dome9 active management. I've fixed the problem, and then as I switch this toggle over to full protection, now I can rest assured knowing nobody or nothing. It might not be an individual logging into the AWS console. It might be the first run of an automation script that does some clever configuration of a security group, for example. Perhaps that automation script is erroneous and does something that brings you out of compliance, Dome9 will be sure via this tamper protection mechanism to remove those conditions, those rules that bring you out of compliance, and make sure that the fixes you instituted stay fixed long term. Region lock is similar. It's for net new security groups rather than watching your existing security groups, right? So maybe you have new security groups being established either, again, by people or process. Region lock will either trust those, will move them, will inherit them into full protection, will inherit them into read-only mode, which is similar. Dome9 will tell you when these deviations happen, but we'll leave it to you to go fix them, or will not trust them at all and will clear them and really mandate that you come to Dome9 and build those rules within the Dome9 product rather than at the respective cloud console, in this case AWS. So I just want to make sure you understand that the compliance and governance feature set is the way to find and in some ways correct where your deviations are, but there are other portions of Dome9 within the network security side of things that can really keep you in that compliance state over time. So Dome9 is really full of these extended capabilities. We talked about compliance and governance. There's a lot more to Dome9 around active identity and access management, sort of privilege, credential protection. There's the ability, we talked a little bit about tamper protection. We have features for time-limited, just-in-time access to network services. We call that dynamic access leasing. It allows you to keep the attack surface very low in a security group, but allow, on an exception basis, people or process to open up a port, maybe SSH, for example, for a time-limited amount of time, whereby when you're done, it recloses again, right? So that you don't have to open up an SSH port to the whole entire world. To follow an example we've kind of been charting throughout the webinar. As well as something I alluded to earlier called clarity, whereby you can get a Visio-like diagram of all of the different paths that network traffic can take based on your security group rule sets. One thing we haven't talked about a lot is that everything you've seen me do, including the compliance assessments, you can do by API. Right, so we looked at the interactive path of selecting a rule bundle, running an assessment, looking at the results interactively, but all of that can also be done pragmatically through the use of the API, which means you can trigger an assessment, you can capture the results in any kind of scripted situation, you can evaluate those results pragmatically by code, and maybe take different kinds of remediation or notification options that are important to your organization. That's very well supported. Dome9 strives to be really kind of equivalent both on the interactive side and the API side. So anything that I've done in this webinar interactively, you can also do with the Dome9 API. And we've got just a few minutes, I think, left for questions. That's it for today. I hope that that's given you a kind of a deeper than high level, let's say a medium level perspective on the capabilities of the Dome9 Compliance and Governance Engine, the capabilities of GSL, the Governance Specification Language, and just how powerful it is compared to having to define your custom rules in a code kind of developer skill set kind of way. Thelen, do we have questions from our participants?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. It looks like we have a few questions. The first one is, AWS has their own compliance-related capabilities. What does Dome9 have to offer over these?
That's a great question. A couple things. One is, as we talked about, AWS has really good compliance perspective at the host level. Dome9 is more about the the security group and above. Let's call it the service level kinds of conditions you want to test for. But even with AWS, when you think about config rules, for example, if you're trying to test something that a pre-canned test does not exist for, you are going to write code. And that's one of the things, we talked about kind of competitive third-party tool sets, but even AWS proper, you're going to write code, you're going to write Lambda functions, and this is what the GSL method really strives to avoid, right? And with the overall goal of being able to get the policy creator themselves closer to being able to write rules, kind of, you know, a test for these conditions that are important organizationally. That's probably the first key difference. The second, of course, is, and we talked a lot about AWS within the context of this webinar, but Dome9 is multi-cloud enabled. So, you know, being able to write rules that you will then assert not only against AWS, but Azure and GCP, as you saw within the dashboard, and I think as I can show you here, right, we have rule bundles for each platform we support, is obviously a very powerful multi-cloud kind of enabled strategy as well. So not only can you test, you know, your AWS accounts, but you can test really any account that Dome9 has support for using the compliance and governance engine. So I think those are probably the two main differences. There are more, but I think you know, those are the two big ones.
Okay. Another question that we have: can I automatically fix problems when the compliance engine finds things that are not compliant?
You absolutely can, and that's one of the things I think that that we alluded to but didn't really have the time to go into. So let me bring up a quick page, and I'll reshare my screen out. Here we go. So you absolutely can. We talked about how you can manually go and from a security group perspective, at least, you can go and you can fix problems, you can turn on tamper protection, but even within the compliance and governance engine itself, when there are failures, so think about that case of, you know, let's write a rule that says any instance should be based on, you know, the following set of pre-approved AMIs. AMI is sort of a Amazon machine image, you know, equivalent to a template. You know, if we wrote a rule like that and we got results back that showed me how many instances in any given AWS account didn't conform to those AMIs, where it was based on maybe some ad hoc instantiation, I could use what we have called the Cloud Supervisor project to capture the results coming out of the compliance engine and automatically take action against them. Namely, there are a couple actions that come stock with the project. I could turn them off. So let's say you know, I find a handful of instances that are not based on pre-approved templates. I could actually, you may consider this a heavy-handed approach. In some really regulated, very sort of formal environments, this may be exactly what you're looking for. Any instance that isn't based on pre-approved templates, I want to turn off. I want to immediately stop, because that is risk in my organization. That's risk in my infrastructure. I could do that using this project we have called Cloud Supervisor. And Cloud Supervisor is an open source project. It leverages the compliance engine to understand where you do deviate from that desired baseline, and then it carries out either pre-canned actions, and these are the ones we support out of the box, being able to stop instances, being able to tag resources conditionally, being able to send custom SNS notifications, presumably, you know, tied to maybe a SIM tool set or something that you will you know, trigger action or notification off of on your end. But you know, this project exists for you to also build your own custom actions as well. You may want to do something like you know, quarantine that instance by stripping its security group and assigning one that that has no firewall inbound or outbound privileges until you have the ability to go and qualify it, right? You could easily write an action like that as well. So in combination with this project called Cloud Supervisor, you can do some automatic remediation based on the findings of the Dome9 compliance engine.
Great. And we have a few more questions. What sort of access does Dome9 need to my cloud accounts in order to be able to work?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. This policy in the read-write mode gives you the ability to, gives Dome9 the ability to go and actually actively manage some things for you. So to be able to delete or create security group rules, to be able to create or delete tags. And I think I was on mute, so I'll just go back and show you quickly. The read-only mode really only gives you, or really gives Dome9 rather, privilege to, read logs, get attributes around the configuration state of your security controls. It gives Dome9 no privilege to really write any changes back to your account. So depending, and you do this on an account by account basis. So it depends a little bit on, are you onboarding a staging account or even a production account whereby you want Dome9 to carry out effective management, policy control enforcement, or whether you want Dome9 just to really be your information partner, alerting you where configuration state deviates from your baseline, and then you'll go and you'll remediate that on your own. That's how you connect your account to Dome9.
Okay. All right. Well, at this point, we are out of time. Thank you, Patrick. All right, everyone. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for attending. If you have any further questions on the information presented today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via the email q&anda@dome9.com. I have a few final notes. If you enjoyed the webinar presented today and would like to experience the Dome9 ARC platform for yourself, we are offering a more detailed personal demo or 14-day free trial. Please visit our website at www.dome9.com and click on the Get Started button on our home page. Just register and a representative from Dome9 will contact you to schedule a demo or activate your free trial. Additionally, if you liked the webinar today and would like to hear more about the multi-cloud security solutions Dome9 provides, please visit the resources page on our website and sign up for several of our upcoming webinars, or go to www.dome9.com/webinars. If there's a topic you would like us to discuss, please contact us through our website and let us know. With that, thank you for your time, and we hope you found the content today informative. This now concludes the Dome9 webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.